and Director of the Herman Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, thank you all for coming here. I know on tax day you could be doing all manner of more fun things like legal tax evasion, but instead you're spending your time with us here today to talk about regulations. Now, I want to start by saying that I think we all know this. A lot of what the government does is impose burdens on the American people, on our prosperity. Taxes are, of course, one of those, and they're right in front of your face because they're the taxes that you file. Of course, the federal deficit imposes inflation burdens on all of us. But while taxes and inflation and deficits are bad, they are largely a tax burden on things that exist. Regulations are a tax burden on things that haven't come into existence, things that might have been but won't be because of the regulations. So if you think of it this way, and we are a few days after the anniversary of the Titanic sinking, taxes and deficits are the above the water part of the iceberg of what is holding back the American economy, but regulations are all of the things below the waterline. And so part of what we want to walk through with you today is while there are CBO scores and JCT scores on the exact nature of taxes and deficits, it is very hard to get a firm capture on the burden of regulations. We have an amazing panel here today, and part of their expertise is unpacking exactly that, how to quantify these burdens, what these burdens are in fact. But I want to give you one other thing to think about as we get into this. The task of an economy is to figure out how to organize all of our efforts together to produce things that are of a genuine service to everyone around us. Part of what regulations do is they prevent us from being able to do that kind of coordination. They prevent us from being able to figure out ways to be of service to each other. And in fact, that is what GDP is. It's not $30 trillion. It's that we produce $30 trillion worth of goods and services for everyone around us. And it's important to recognize some of the specific burdens from regulations. If you ask the National Home Builders Association, they will tell you that $100,000 of the cost of a new home, a quarter of the price, is just from regulations. The Association of Manufacturers will tell you that on average, per worker engaged in manufacturing, there is a burden of $29,000 per worker just from regulations. Again, these are crushing. They have been stifling the economy. We will never know what amazing innovations, prosperity, improvements to quality and length of life we have lost because of regulatory burdens. But I want to give you one other thing to think through before I introduce our amazing panel to walk through all their results and the work that we are all doing to undo these regulations. As we sit here today, Passover is going on in the Jewish faith, and of course we're preparing for Easter. These are holidays that celebrate the importance of freedom, of respecting human dignity, the walk through the wilderness, the walk that left Egypt and led to everything about the foundations of the West and all of the amazing advancements we've made, not just material, but spiritual as well. And of course, Easter representing rebirth and an embrace of that. What I want to ask you today is join us in this walk of faith, a faith that if we deregulate, there will be innovators and entrepreneurs that fill the gap, that can invent solutions to the problems we have today that no one has yet thought of solutions for. And that is really what deregulation is about embracing that spirit of what is possible. It is about freeing ourselves and our neighbors to produce in a way that can benefit all of us and for generations to come. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel that we've got before you today. So we have Patrick McLaughlin, who is the inventor and creator of the Reg Data and the QuantGov projects, whose data was instrumental to all of the work we'll go through today. He's written dozens of peer-reviewed articles, testified numerous times in front of Congress, and is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Of course, we've got our own Parker Shepard, who's a research fellow in CDA, our Center for Data Analysis here. And he, of course, is the architect and the mastermind behind our growth models and our models that can help us score tax and spending legislation, and of course now deregulation. His work's been instrumental in debates in Congress, and of course we hope to continue that as we go forward. We have Bill Beach, who of course was the founder of CDA here before, who is now a senior fellow in economics at EPIC, which is of course one of our friendly organizations. and had been the 15th commissioner of labor statistics at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And before that, had been the chief economist for the Senate Budget Committee. As you can tell, he wears many hats, but actually he wears many hats. You should ask him about his collection after this. And then we've got Giancarlo Canapero from Heritage as well, who is a senior legal fellow with the Ed Meese Center here. His work has been featured in many law reviews, including that of Harvard and Georgetown. And of course, his work lies at the heart of all of Heritage's work to restore Article I authority, respect for the Constitution, and to truly get back to a society that has the rule of law. So with that, I'd like to invite all of them to come up and join us. And thank you. All right, well, thank you all for coming today, and of course, thank you for listening to our conversation here. Patrick, let's start off. So, of course, you've done more work than almost anybody to really get into the weeds and quantify exactly what the burdens of regulations are. And I think, again, for a lot of people, you can think of numbers attached to taxes or spending programs, but can you walk us through exactly why it is so complicated and convoluted to really quantify the burden of regulations and to get into the weeds on that?
Yeah, thanks. I think you touched on the heart of the problem. It's that regulations occur as text as opposed to numbers. With tax data, with tax rates, you have numbers. And economists, of course, like to have numbers to put into our models so you can see things like the unseen burden of that iceberg that sank the Titanic. So that was the problem facing me when I first started working in regulation over a decade ago. And to solve that problem, I ultimately had to use computers. There's just too much regulation for, actually, this is a good lesson, I think, right here at the beginning. Regulation is so voluminous, there's so much regulation that no person could read it. Well, you could. It would take you over 3 years if you read as your full-time job to read through all federal regulations. So that was not something I was going to do, and so in order to come up with numbers from regulations for all regulations, have this for every year that we could, I had to use computer programs. And so if you go to my first slide there, is that showing? There we go. So when I first started this project, the Reg Data project, I looked at all the books of federal regulation, and this is a video I made in 2014 or so, 15, somewhere in there. And I was stacking up all the federal regulations. I was in a law office that let me borrow their books, and making a video out of this. You can find this on YouTube. And at some point in the video, this wall of regulations started to fall over, and the cameraman had to come over and rescue me. And so while there's a common complaint that you hear that businesses feel like they're being crushed by regulations. They mean that figuratively. I was almost literally crushed by regulations early on in this project. So that's what made me move over to using computers. And so if you go to the next slide, what I ultimately settled upon was just going through the text of regulations and looking for the action words, if you will. Like what are regulations doing? What are they designed to do? By definition, regulations are trying to change what you do, what businesses do. If they weren't trying to change what you do, they wouldn't come into existence. So you look for those words that are trying to alter your choices, words like shall and must and may not and prohibited. So if you count this up and see how it grows over time, that's what this graph is. We started with about 400,000 different restrictive terms, these shalls and musts in 1970, and today we're over 1 million, although with President Trump's deregulatory efforts, we probably see those numbers go down very soon. So that at a basic level is that's what I did, just count up words in the text. And now I have numbers for regulation for different points in time. And that's very valuable for going back and plugging that into our models. Now, the next thing I did is try to break it up into different categories. Which sectors of the economy, which industries of the economy are being affected by these words? This was a little bit more complicated. You couldn't just count up words. So this part involves some machine learning algorithms. These days, pretty much everyone's familiar with machine learning because you use ChatGPT, which is really just machine learning on steroids. And back when I made this, though, that wasn't around. the way that I made these different algorithms to figure out which industries are affected by regulation just involved training a machine. I found a bunch of documents that were labeled, basically labeled according to the industry that they affected. For example, a regulation that affects hospitals. If it says it in that regulation that this is affecting hospitals, I treated that as a labeled training document. Gathered about 23,000 of these labeled documents, trained a bunch of algorithms to read these things and figure out what words indicate different industries, and then I set those algorithms loose on the text of the set of the Code of Federal Regulations itself. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you the result here. The result is we have data now of how regulated every different industry in the economy is at different points in time. And so this is just one of dozens of different industries we have data for. This is finance and insurance, basically banking we're looking at, banking and insurance. So how regulated it is over time, and you can see post-2010 when Dodd-Frank was implemented, the number just went up tremendously, I think roughly tripled since 2010, how regulated the industry is. So we have graphs like this for all industries now, and that enables us to do the great work that Parker and Bill have been doing.
Well, thank you so much. Again, and I want to stress, I'd been a congressional staffer a long time ago, and Bill Posey had a stack of regulations in the corner of his office as well, which nearly crushed me and a few other staffers at different times.
I'm glad you made it.
Not always when you see the debates going on in Congress. But to your point, though, I want to highlight as well, a lot of people have tried looking at the issue, and the only data we had was pages in the regulatory code. What you've really put together here is really the first truly comprehensive database with all of these different things really capturing the architecture of that iceberg as it comes close to us. So with that, Parker, I want to turn to you on this. You and Bill, of course, took this data and have done a lot of work with it and have a new paper that's out. So I want to know first, if you could walk through with us how you put the paper together, the methodology, what's the process of it? How did you take all of this data that Patrick put together and start yielding results from it?
Yeah, we got started by trying to think about what a deregulatory effort would mean for the economy, and we started looking through the economic literature, and there really was not a lot of good results out there, precisely because of how difficult it is to quantify, to measure regulation, but then also to say how is it that firms are handling it, what is the mechanism by which regulation affects firms? We looked at one of the papers that Patrick had written with reg data as a good inspiration, where they had gone through and estimated a growth model. They had taken a very specific functional form for firms, solved for the economy, and got results from it. We took a different approach that said, we're not going to make any particular assumptions about the way that firms interact with regulations. We just want to know, broadly speaking, in a way that lets the data speak for itself as much as possible, how do regulations and the economy move together? So from that, we estimated a Bayesian vector autoregression. And you can think about that as basically a line of best fit. You're probably used to going to Excel. If you have some data, you can plot, give me the line of best fit through it, gives you an intercept and a slope. And that's for two different data series. Well, this is for 7 different data series all at once. We have regulations that come through as measured by reg data, plus GDP, consumption, investment, hours worked, at the price level, and interest rates. So we can feed the data into the model, estimate the vector autoregression, and that gives us a way to forecast what would happen in the future for all 7 of those time series. And we can run different conditional forecasts. So one thought experiment might be what would happen to the economy if we were to freeze regulations. There's a baseline forecast in which regulations grow according to the model, but also we can specify an alternative scenario where, suppose we just said no more regulations for the next 10 years. What would that look like for the economy? What would that look like within the next budget window?
No, and that's amazing. And again, this gets back to the work we've been trying to do here of trying to make this sensible, digestible frankly, in the way that we have decades of work when it comes to government spending and tax policy, what you're seeing here is the beginning of having it be that easy to access, but now about regulation. So now that we know what you were looking at, how you were doing it, what were the results? I mean, other than regulations being bad, of course, walk us through the numbers on it.
Sure, let me just pull this up here on the chart. All right, so this is the same chart that Patrick had showing the growth in regulations. So for context, this is where we've been with regulations. And then this here is the scenario that we ran. So this is zoomed in a little bit, and you can see this is the median forecast for the baseline, and the cone there is the 68% confidence interval in the forecast. So there's a 2/3 chance that growth in regulation falls within that zone. In our alternative specification, we said at the end of the sample, at the end of 2022, let's just freeze regulation at that level and hold it constant for the next 10 years. So that amounts to a 5.7% reduction, 4% reduction in regulations after the end of 10 years. Now, what does that do to the economy? Well, here is real gross domestic product. Now, regulation is but a part of everything that happens to the economy, including here, you can notice the very sharp drop coming from the lockdowns during COVID. So that is part of what's driving the uncertainty that we see here in the confidence intervals. But you can still see that even though the distributions overlap a bit, with regulation frozen, there's a shift in the distribution. And it would amount to an increase in the median forecast of 1.8% growth in real GDP at the end of 10 years. Now, for comparison, some estimates have looked at just the simple cost of extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that would put it around about 0.5% of GDP in the long run, based off of Tax Foundation's estimates. Some of our internal estimates think that that's pretty similar. Other estimates actually find even smaller results. So for reference, a lot of the top line discussion has been around what to do with extending the Trump tax cuts. And for reference here, this would produce an even bigger effect on economic growth if you were just to simply hold regulation constant, not to mention the target that the Trump administration has put out of having a reduction of 10 regulations for every new one promulgated. So we didn't just affect real gross domestic product, we have consumption, goes up by 1.7%. That growth in the economy is driven largely by an increase in investment, which goes up 7.8%. And that's coming from the fact that with a lower compliance cost, firms invest more, there's a better return to capital. And so with that, workers become more productive. And we see hours worked going up 1.4% by the end of the forecast window. But the big result is when you look at the price level. Remember, the price level increase in the cost of living was the major issue in the last election, and it's something that that voters are looking for Congress and the administration to make progress on in these next 2 years. By the end of the forecast window, we see the price level go down by 5.7%. This was the strongest result. That corresponds to, in inflation terms, that's a reduction in 0.6% per year for the next 10 years. Now, the other thing to worry about is that we're spending over $1 trillion a year because of the high federal debt load. So that means that if we see a corresponding reduction in inflation expectations, then we'd also get a reduction in interest rates. And we see that in the forecast as well. By the end of the 10-year window, interest rates come down by about 0.6% per year, which would generate a very significant cost savings for the Treasury. That's all I've got.
Well, and thank you very much, of course. And I think what you're seeing here, of course, is just even a short time horizon. If you committed to reducing regulations or having no new regulations, you can see dramatic impacts, reduced prices, more job opportunities, higher wages for all workers, more production, more output. And one of the things I want to mention as well, I think is important for all of us here, a lot of people will say, look, why should we care so much about maximizing GDP? And one of the things I would point out, and I think you see it in all of Parker's work here, is it's maximizing what you produce with the time you spend working. If you might be watching saying, well, I care about other societal benefits, I don't care as much about economic growth, you can come talk to all of us for hours afterward as well. Maybe we'll convince you. But the other thing I want to point out is, if you do the things we're talking about here, if there's more productivity per worker, per American, it means that more of those hours are free to spend doing non-commercialized things. That deregulation is both about material prosperity, but it is also about liberating your time in a way where you can spend it with your families and in your communities. But moving on to another practical application of this, Bill, I want to ask you, I've been told that there's this reconciliation thing going on in Congress, and that while Congress is trying to figure out how to cut spending and extend Trump's tax cuts and cut taxes further, there's this question about deficits, and that Congress is looking for pay-fors. And I wanted to ask you, because I know you've been plugged in, working with people over there, what do you think the ramifications of the revenue growth that Parker's been talking about, what do you think that could play in to all the politics that's going on with reconciliation right now?
So let me just back up a little bit, Richard. This is such an interesting topic. I've been through reconciliation before when I was chief economist at the Senate Budget Committee, and now that I'm with my colleagues at EPIC who are back there, we're advising members on that. And, in reconciliation, there's a lot of things that matter. I mean, my gosh, politics is, I hate to break this to you, but there's a lot of politics going on right over there on reconciliation. But the key things that you're interested in is meeting your deficit reduction target and meeting your revenue targets. And your deficit reduction targets have to be met through programs. And you just can't go out and grab a bunch of deficit reduction. They have to be connected. So as these results began to come out, as Parker was sharing various simulations, I began to think, this is very interesting and could have a big impact over on the reconciliation side. Why? Because with the big interest rate reduction that we're seeing in the model, the drop in the price level as measured by the CPI, then that would mean lower program costs and probably lower interest rate outlays. Not to mention that with higher output, there should be higher revenues. But we did not estimate revenues. We did not estimate any budget concepts at all in this paper. So as we are getting, as is post-production, post-publication, I became really curious about this. And I used just a notional calculator that CBO provides everyone in this room. Don't get on your phone right now to get it out, but you could use the same notional calculator. It's not an official scoring, right? CBO has to do the official scoring for the purposes of reconciliation. It has to be done. But this is good enough. And I only put in 2 of our results. The others, by the way, were so large that the calculator wouldn't absorb them. But the 2, interest rates and inflation, and when I hit go, it produced a $1.03 trillion deficit reduction over 10 years. So I began to use the telephone, as it were, to call my friends on the Hill and say, would you be interested in $1 trillion of unexpected deficit reduction? I think we would. It's not coming through tariffs. It's not coming through this. Greenland is not going to produce that for you. Well, the sad part of this story, that's the good part. The sad part of this story is that Congress is so unfamiliar with the effects of regulation changes, even a freeze, that this is territory that they have a huge learning curve on. That said, there's a very keen interest right now, today, right this moment, in seeing our results translated by CBO when they come back into town at the end of the month to begin to mark up the reconciliation bills in both chambers, that, yeah, maybe we can introduce something like these changes in regulation to the reconciliation. It's a big ask. Still have to get past the parliamentarian and the Senate. But let me just conclude my little piece here and then say this. The future of the Congress will require the Congress and the CBO to get smart about regulation. Lober-Bright, that big decision on Chevron deference, maybe the first of many cases to come from the Supreme Court, empowers Article 1 to do more, that's the Congress, to do more in the regulatory area. It's not prepared to do so. CBO needs to get a whole new unit put together to do regulatory analysis. The budget committees need to think about how does regulation affect revenues, outlays, all kinds of program elements. All these things are frontier issues. And the paper that we've done, and Patrick's amazing work, and the key importance of reg data in all of this, I think promises well. I think there is a direction that we can take now, and that we need to encourage Congress to take. So this is a frontier issue. It's not so much in the economic portfolio a frontier matter. We've been talking about regulation for decades. And I have lived for decades, so I can tell you, I'm the only one up here with less hair, and that's because I've been thinking about regulation for a lot. We need to encourage Congress, both chambers, to get really smart on this topic, Richard.
No, and Bill, I think you hit the nail right on the head on that one. That this is really a topic about measuring the true nature of government's burdens, and about getting involved in the politics to make sure that Congress does the right thing. And I think you brought this up before, but a lot of people don't like math; they don't feel comfortable with it. But even then, on the Hill, there's a real sense of comfort, if you can call it that, with the notion of topics around tax and spending policy, and it's precisely because we have budgets. Because these staffers are inundated with all manner of messaging and communications from constituents back home talking about this number, that number, because they come from CBO. Right. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to say that everybody knows exactly what the numbers mean, but a lot of them sound very scary, and they are, in fact. Yeah. But when it comes to regulations, this is such a frontier in Congress that nobody has those numbers. They don't have a way of getting their minds and their hands around what the scope of the issue is. One of the things I want to ask you about as well is, you've done a lot of work on something related to this, but a little different, which is the idea of a reg budget. Not just looking at the impact of regulations on the federal budget, but actually going through and replicating that structure that has given rise to so much conversation about taxes and spending, but cloning that process, making something that can allow regs to enjoy the same position in conversation, and to put it on people's forefronts as much as well. So I want to ask you, do you think there's finally an opportunity here that we can do reg budgeting? And if you could walk through for everybody, what does that really mean, and what could that open up as opportunities?
I sure hope this is the breakthrough. Maybe a breakthrough moment is what it takes. One of those things. So what is a regulatory budget? Well, we have one of the experts in the hall today, Rich Fullenbaum, who wrote one of the early papers on regulatory budgeting. I think it was 1978. Now, I hope I'm not dating you, Rich, but one of our great economists here in the Washington area, and we're all very grateful to his past work. The concept then, as now, is for Congress to annually budget the amount of regulations that they are willing to authorize. Now, this is kind of an area where Congress didn't have a lot of options for action, right? Because prior to Lober-Bright, they would pass a law and they would defer to the regulatory bodies to produce the regulatory matter. That is, the regulations and the guidance documents. And that will still be the case. But the deference is gone and Congress has more control. So a regulatory budget could work a number of ways. The simplest way is to use the reg data set that Patrick has given us, and the sort of the algorithms or the equations that are developed in the paper that Parker and I did, or in other papers, and have CBO say, okay, you want to regulate the shoe industry. Says it's terrible not to have regulations for the shoe industry. It's all these people going around with unregulated shoes in this country. So we estimate that if you do regulate the shoe industry, this will increase the compliance costs for shoe companies by this amount, and we'll do a few other things. Now, this is not a cost-benefit analysis, as you would have it done by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the White House, but it's a burden analysis. And this is what reg data is so good at. And so Congress would look at this and say, well, these are really important regulations. We need shoe regulations, but this analysis says it'll reduce consumption, it'll reduce investment, and it'll reduce output. are we willing to live with those reductions to get the benefit of regulated shoes? That's a budget decision, right? That's a decision that Congress makes every day with respect to things like how much should we spend on Medicaid or how much should we spend on defense. They have to make these decisions. And so if we had a regulatory budget, they would make those decisions annually and would say, this year we're not going to do shoes. We're not going to do shoes, but we're going to continue in this area. Or let's have a 1% reduction in regulation. We'll find it, we'll ask the regulatory agencies to do that, reduce it so the compliance costs or go down by a certain percentage and we get a net 1% reduction in regulations. Because that'll produce more revenues. That'll produce more output. Regulatory budgets need to happen. There is a regulatory budget bill right now ready to, it's fully cured in the Commerce Committee. It's in the House, ready to go onto the floor. And it might actually get on the floor really rapidly because this would give us a piece of legislation in the Commerce Committee to which we could tie these results and say, okay, the parliamentarian in the Senate say, okay, do you have a piece of legislation that you're going to propose? Here it is. And it connects into this. And so that's the breakthrough moment. We need regulatory budgeting. Congress should be in charge of the burden that they put on the American people. If they are in charge of taxes, and in charge of tariffs, and in charge of the other costs that they impose, they need to be in charge of the regulatory burden. And so that's where the regulatory budget is. One more word. We've tried this for years. But Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a person of mixed reputation, let's say, did say one really smart thing. Well, many smart things. And he said one, that you never get anything in Washington unless you try to get it for 25 years. And that's just about where we're at with the reg budget concept.
I think that's beautifully said. And again, as we're talking about through all of this, before Congress can act, and Congress finds every reason not to act, but before they can, they need to be able to understand the scope of the issue. And this is exactly the way to do that. Now, to kind of switch gears a little bit into this, Patrick, I know you've done a lot of work, obviously, not just building these databases, being the founder of the Feast in terms of all the qualitative work, but you've also done a lot of work looking into what this means, what it means industry by industry, what these burdens translate to in the real world. Can you walk us through some of the prior work you've done and the results you found?
Sure. To your point, the reason I built reg data was because I wanted to do more analysis of what is the effect of regulations on things like economic growth. I am an economist by training. So after I had the data put together, one of the first studies I did with a couple of co-authors, Bentley Coffey and Pietro Pareto, was a study that Parker referenced earlier. We built this model of the economy. The economy grows in this model through deliberate decisions that businesses make, these investment choices that businesses make. These investments by businesses leads to innovation, leads to things like new inventions or just expansion of operations, and then that in turn leads to, as you mentioned earlier, greater productivity. And then in the long run, greater productivity, total factor productivity growth drives economic growth. So we built a model that has all these features in it. Why did we build the model? Because we had to simulate what would happen to the economy if it wasn't as regulated as the one that we live in. So built out this model, put the data in there, estimated how the model is affected by regulations, when regulations grow, and then went back and did a simulation. Say, starting in 1980, what if we held regulations constant, a freeze, if you will, of how much regulation there is, what would happen to the economy thereafter? And our results are very similar to what Parker and Bill found. We found that total factor productivity grows faster when you have a less regulated economy. That translates into nearly 1 percentage point of GDP growth more in that simulation versus what we actually observed. And over time, that becomes a big effect, right? If the economy is growing, is 0.8 was the number, 0.8 of a percentage point faster every year, and do that year after year after year, eventually that's a lot of GDP growth that you could experience and benefit from. So, but digging into some of the details here, I think this is the interesting point, one of the interesting points, that if you just look at the top level results of the paper, that's great, but digging in, where did the investment changes occur? So we did that digging, and we looked at all the different industries and said, all right, what industries are we seeing invest more when deregulation or when regulation doesn't grow like it actually did? And one of the big numbers that stood out, one of the changes that stood out was the oil and gas extraction industry. Well, why did that happen? Why did oil and gas extraction have such great investment in the years that we're studying here, have such good response to a less regulated environment? Well, we went back, and this drove a lot of our results. We went back and looked at it. The 2005 Energy Policy Act was driving a lot of these results. And what was that? That was a congressional deregulatory action. So if you think about what happened between 2005 and now, a lot of the shale gas and shale oil revolution, if you will, it took place over the last 20 years. America went from whatever it was to the largest energy producer in the world because of shale oil and shale gas. This was enabled by this 2005 Energy Policy Act, specifically the Safe Drinking Water Act exemption for hydraulic fracturing was in that 2005 Act. There was a Clean Water Act stormwater runoff exemption for oil and gas extraction built into that act. There was some streamlining of NEPA built into that. And so the table was set, if you will, for investment by businesses through congressional action, which was deregulatory in nature. And this drove so much of our results. So I point this out because, I mean, Bill, you're talking about the need for Congress to act. Well, Congress did act in 2005. There was a deregulatory action, and that, I think, it definitely drove a lot of the results that we saw. And I suspect there's a lesson there going forward.
Absolutely. And again, as we've all been talking here about the economics of it, about what the results are, where they can likely be, some of the efforts have been done, as Bill and I were talking about, you can't do anything unless you can get Congress to change the law. So, Giancarlo, now we're going to move to the part of this about how we actually change the law. I want to ask you, I know that obviously there's been a few court cases that have happened recently that have meant dramatically different impacts on Chevron and some of these other long-standing things that took power away from Congress and gave it to the executive branch. But then we also have this amazing thing called the Congressional Review Act, not been used as much, but there's been a flurry of resolutions in Congress. Can you walk us through both these court cases, what the CRAs are, and what's exciting about these opportunities in front of Congress right now?
Yes, so let me begin by explaining what the heck the lawyer's doing up on the stage with a bunch of data wizards. As a lawyer, what I want predominantly is strong rule of law, which means, among other things, stability in the law and predictability in the law. And there are a number of ways in which our regulatory environment undermines both of those goals. So if you are a regulated party, you face, broadly speaking, three sources of regulatory uncertainty. The question is always, what is the content of the law? So if regulations or the laws that authorize them are not written clearly, you really have no idea what the content of the law is. Add to that the risk that comes from flip-flopping administrations, and you've got a change in enforcement priorities. So even if you have a good sense of what you think the best reading of the statute is, an administration comes along and changes it and pulls the rug out from underneath you. And then the last one is there's a question of uncertainty with regs that may be clear, but are not necessarily enforced. When, if at all, will those regs be deployed and against whom? So the way that most people comply when faced with these sorts of uncertainties is, first of all, to hire lawyers. And like many lawyers, I'm self-hating, so I want less regulatory lawyers because most of what they do is facilitate rent seeking, right?
There you go.
Yeah, I'm going to get some angry emails, maybe from my own wife, who does a lot of this, because somebody has to do it, and one of us has to pay the bills.
Economists are rent seeking too.
So the question is really like, what are some good ways of, especially Congress can come along, and what ways have the courts come along to eliminate some of this sort of uncertainty? So we mentioned the Loper-Bright decision, which ended Chevron. Chevron said, if there is an ambiguity in a statute, the agencies get to pick their reading, whichever reading they want, provided it's reasonable. That proved to be wildly unworkable, particularly in an era of increasing polarization, particularly in an era of increasing executive lawmaking through the agencies, so that you could have Biden come along, say, and reread half a dozen acts to say, actually, I can just cancel student loans, right? Like tendentious. Or to read OSHA to say I can impose a vaccine mandate on tendentious. But these were the sorts of things that Chevron encouraged, which created immense uncertainty. And then, as Patrick well knows, and he and I have written a paper on this with respect to the criminal law, when you have tons and tons and tons of law, you functionally have no law at all. Because there aren't enough bureaucrats to enforce it. There's not enough resources to enforce it equally. And so you as a regulated party, face this wall of law, and you don't know which part of it, if any, is going to fall on you, but you know that some part of it is. So I think this is, if you want to know, like, what was the moment that radicalized me? Actually, that probably happened a long time ago. But one recent one, there was a hospital, a Catholic hospital, I believe in Boston. And in this hospital, they maintained a very small chapel. And whichever order of the Catholic Church organized this chapel, it's very important to them that they have a candle lit all the time in this chapel. A little tiny tea candle in a glass wall sconce. Somebody at the Department of whatever regulates hospitals decided, you know what, I don't really like that Catholic hospital. I'm going to threaten all of their Medicaid funding because there's a law on the books, a reg on the books that says if a hospital maintains a lighted flame, it must be supervised at all times or you are ineligible for all your Medicaid. And so they came after this hospital for this. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me, right? Just insane. So where was I? Now I'm mad.
Radicalized. Now you're as radicalized as I hope everybody in this room is.
Right, so let's get back. How do we rein this in? Okay, so number one, a faithful steward of the administrative state in the White House can do this, but here's your problem, right? You've got 4 years, maybe 8 years. There's always regulatory uncertainty. Even if a president comes in, you've got this 10-to-1 executive order, things are going great. A regulated entity doesn't think in terms of 4-year timelines, right? If you're a hospital, you're plotting out, your regulatory compliance over decades. Banks, insurance companies, oil and gas, particularly heavy capital investment type industries, need regulatory certainty. That doesn't just mean that they're not regulated now. Deregulation is helpful, but the assurity that the wall's not going to fall on them tomorrow, or 5 years down the road, or 10 years down the road is really important. So it's not enough to have a president in office who cares about deregulation. You need systems in place to prevent another Biden administration coming along and being really, really aggressive and partisan with respect to the regulatory authority. So really the best way to do that is Congress, right? The courts can do some, but courts don't exist to do that. That's not what they're trying to do, nor should it be, right? You don't want a Supreme Court, it's just like an anti-regulation body. There are higher values that you want courts to be instantiating and defending. So Congress really has to come along. So you've got the Congressional Review Act. There are 2 ways of using the Congressional Review Act. There's the normal way and there's the creative way. The normal way, I think we're just about out of time now. You get 60 calendar days. If we haven't reached 60 calendar days already, we're very nearly about to. But there's the creative way. The creative way, my colleague Paul Larkin gets a lot of credit for this. He noticed that the CRA applies to rules which have been submitted to Congress. And if a rule, which is broadly defined, this isn't just regulations. Rules means under the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, which sets the CRA's definition of rule. It's convoluted, but we're getting there. Rules are a lot of things. Policy memos. One judge in the Fifth Circuit has a very famous sort of pithy combination of this. Anytime an agency communicates with you, it's a rule. If those are not submitted to Congress, Congress can CRA them at any time. So here's the creative way that you could do this. And Paul and I wrote a paper particularly for the DoD about this on DEI stuff. You go through all your old policy memos and opinion and sort of statements of legal opinion on this or that, and you find, oh, look, here's a DEI memo that said DEI is what DOJ is all about. or DOD is all about now. That's not a reg, so chances are it hasn't been sent to Congress. It is a rule, however, and you send that to Congress now, and then now Congress can CRA it. What that means is now Congress has basically an unlimited window to do that. There's a little cooperation between Congress and the administration. You can sort of create your window when it's advantageous to you. And then what happens if Congress CRAs a rule? It's dead forever, forever. And anything which is substantially similar to it is dead forever until Congress comes along. So Congress can deregulate creatively that way with a cooperative administration. There are two other policy areas I'd love to see Congress get some work done on. There's always the REINS Act. It's a perennial sort of eligible bachelor or eligible bacheloress in the wings waiting for somebody to come along and take her to prom. Great, that's fantastic. That's Mike Lee, I think, is the chief author of that. And then this one will sound at first like it comes out of left field. It doesn't. Emergency powers. So emergency powers are an enormous source of executive branch, functionally lawmaking, regulatory authority. The president can basically run the country for 2 years on emergency powers if he wants to. And a lot of presidents do want to, for obvious reasons. But emergency powers are just the most uncertain, create the most uncertainty. When do they begin? When do they end? What powers do they give you? What, if any, sort of judicial review can you get? So there are a lot of good bills that would try to rein in emergency powers. And by rein in, I mean you don't want to eliminate the opportunity of emergency powers. Emergencies happen, but you want Congress to be able to be there, making sure that they're cabined and limited. So, and actually, there's been a lot of bipartisan work on this. Senator Lee has the Article 1 Act. Senator Murphy has the National Securities Powers Act, both of which have some good things in them. And I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate all of it. It reminds me as well that I usually tell people that we have seen more emergencies come from emergency powers than the powers have resolved themselves. But I want to share one other story. As you were talking about all the things that radicalized you, and as I was being re-radicalized, thinking through some of these, when I was working on the Hill at one point, I was an ag staffer for one of the Iowa congressional districts, and this is when Obama was president. And there's a law in the books, which is called WOTUS, the Waters of the United States. It's a regulatory piece of law that is meant to regulate navigable waters of the United States. Obama, with a signature on a piece of paper, defined navigable waters in such a way that 98% of the landmass of the state of Iowa, which is not near any coast, was designated as a navigable water. I used to have a map that I would bring to these farmers, and I'd say, I don't know if you know this, but your entire farm, your entire community, and every piece of land within 100 miles of you is a navigable water to Barack Obama and regulatable under these kind of powers. And that shows you, as Congress has frankly been sloppy in how it's crafted law, as it's delegated that legislative authority to presidents, it has moved our institutions from being Republican and representative of the rule of law and any notion of Constitution. It has maneuvered it into a fiat government, one of these most dangerous things that, of course, the founders fought against. But, Bill, is there something you want to jump in on this?
Very quickly, when I was thinking, you were talking, and I was thinking about the work that Congress does. Daniel Flores was not in the audience and did not, I couldn't call him out at the time. I was looking for you, Daniel. Daniel Flores is one of the great heroes in this whole story. You talk about the evidence of persistence makes for victory. That's Daniel Flores' motto. And if there's any gains here, I think we can say we know who's responsible.
And I want to open up now to take your questions. So let us know if any of you have questions or comments or want to get into a debate with any of us on anything. We're used to it. But I think your point's exactly right there, right? About both the REINS Act and regulatory budgeting. These things take a generation or more sometimes to come to fruition. So, all right, do we have questions from the floor here?
Hi. So I'm very interested, obviously, in the reconciliation bill that's going to be coming up in Congress. We obviously had the budget resolution, joint resolution in the House and Senate, and there was text in there about regulations as being potential. You mentioned that the Senate parliamentarian could potentially overrule what's done there, but obviously there's thought that's being that Congress is considering using regulations to make sure that that budget bill can go through and the tax cuts can be had. So I guess my question though is if you could talk a little bit more about that and what that would actually look like, because if I'm thinking about how you can do regulations, you've talked about some different ways. You can actually go in and you can by law repeal these existing legislations, or you can do something like the REINS Act where you're limiting it. Can you talk a little bit about how that might be scored? Because I think if you're doing something like the REINS Act, it's a little bit more difficult to plot out what that would look like in terms of what the regulatory savings of that might be.
Well, I think the challenge here is to show a budgetary effect. And that under reconciliation is well defined. I'm not going to be here telling you today that all we got to do is get a CBO score and we'll have $1.03 trillion worth of additional funds that can be thrown into reconciliation, because it is a big deal to connect an economic analysis to a program effect that produces a budgetary effect under the reconciliation rules. You're sitting with one of the experts there, and Matt could probably tell you right off, this is a hard slog. That said, we've never had a good run at it as we have right now. So what we're trying to do at the moment is to show CBO a plausible representation of the work that Parker and I have done in a model which they now use, an economic model that they now use, and then have people who are responsible for CBO or can put leverage on CBO saying, we think CBO, you should try to reproduce this analysis and show us a budgetary effect. With that in hand, the case could be made, maybe successfully, that these particular budgetary effects, I think particularly the deficit reduction effect, could be included in the consideration of the goals to be met for reconciliation, the budgetary goals to be met. But that's a big ask. However, we should ask, and we should not let this opportunity go by just because it's a challenge that the parliamentarian may in the Senate may present to us. So.
Can I jump in on this too? Yeah, so I think there's, the basic problem here is, especially for old regulations, we don't have numbers, right? We don't have economic analyses produced even by the agencies for 97, 98% of all rulemakings. So the farther back you go in time, the worse it gets. So you got to come up with some sort of solution here. And what Bill is saying, there's one set of solutions, which is what Bill and Parker have done in their paper. What I did in my paper years ago is you take numbers for regulation, run through a model, and it spits out some results. And CBO can take those results and add that into their spreadsheet, which is basically what you're doing, and say, all right, what's the budgetary effects of all this? It is a lot of work. There is another path too. It's also a lot of work, is you retrospectively produce those economic analyses that are missing for all those regulations that are already on the books.
That's right.
That could also be done though. I mean, you have a smaller army of people working at the agencies, but still an army of people at the agencies that could be tasked with this. You could leverage AI to some extent to produce some of these numbers, but either of these paths, I think they're they're feasible. I think you can demonstrate they're feasible. The path that you and Parker have laid out there, I think that's right there, and CBO can see it. My paper is right there, and CBO can see it. But if you want to go the traditional route, that can be done too.
So a little footnote on what you just said, Patrick. When I was chief economist of the Senate Budget Committee, it was our year to be responsible for CBO. It switches based on parties and chambers and majorities. So I was really responsible for CBO. I felt, like a superpower. And so I spent a lot of time with the CBO executives thinking through how would you do a regulatory budget? If we passed a regulatory budget bill, would you be in position to actually score this? CBO was very open. They would say, no, we're not in a position to score this. We would love to. We would love to be in a position to help you on a regulatory budget. So I asked them to put together their own budget for what it would take to get them ready to go to support this. And so they would create a new division at CBO. It would be the Division for Regulatory Budget Analysis. It would consist of about 50 or 45 analysts They could be borrowed from other parts. So here I am at Heritage thinking we should have a bigger CBO. I apologize, but yes, we should have a bigger CBO. And they would need a little bit of additional funding for that. So those numbers have been worked out. That should be, if indeed this is the future of the Congress and they're supposed to do the regulatory side, we have to go to CBO and say, now here is your 30 million and you can expand your operations to make this happen.
It sounds like an investment to me, perhaps
It's
a
an
worthwhile
investment, Richard. That's it exactly. Yeah,
and it's important to remember you miss 100% of the deregulatory shots you don't take. But Carla, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on that. I wanted to echo this, that if you do regulatory budgeting, it's really important that this be done through Congress and not outsourced to OMB or OIRA.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, although I love OIRA, I think that it's one of the really good agencies we have. OIRA is not free from presidential politicking, right? So in the last, for a very long time, OIRA has done its cost-benefit analysis in a very sort of normal way. But under the Biden administration, they changed Circular A4, which is what governs how OIRA does its cost-benefit analysis, to include equity and a bunch of different sort of mechanisms by which partisan goals can be snuck into cost-benefit analysis. So, however reg budgeting gets done, it needs to be done in a way that sort of shenanigan doesn't get worked into the budgeting analysis.
Anything that concentrates power is a bad thing. So we have more questions on the floor? Absolutely.
Daniel Flores.
Hi, Daniel Flores from the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I just wanted to say to Bill, thank you for your kind words. Bill and I have been working on reg budgeting for a long, long time, so it's good to see him here today. And Bill, I think just one clarifying point, you mentioned earlier in your discussion some particular regulatory budgeting legislation. I think you referred to it being in the Commerce Committee. Are you actually talking about the legislation in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee?
I was talking about the regulatory budgeting legislation that you mentioned to me.
Okay, yeah, that's in Oversight and Government
Thank you,
Reform.
Daniel.
That's all, you bet.
Once again, a lawyer saves an economist.
It happens all the time. That's been my experience. All right, so do we have more questions? Absolutely.
I'm going to speak to you from the viewpoint of the common man now. I'm an MBA dropout. I'm not ashamed of that one bit at all. But I do have 2 masters in foreign affairs, politics, and strategic intelligence. I want to talk to you about the IRA, something which is very near and dear to us and has been that way since its inception back in the 1980s. There has been a multiplicity of regulations, red tape, and confusion with IRAs, rollovers, etc., since the inception of the IRA during the Reagan administration in the 80s. There was a Democrat Congress constantly during Reagan's 2 terms in office. He had a Senate for 6 years, but there was always a Democrat House of Representatives. Do you think that the Democrats threw all these regulations into the IRA as spite work against Ronald Reagan because they were angry at his alleged anti-Social Security sentiment? And do you think that we, the people, could have done even more back then, instead of just sending a bunch of mass-produced postcards in that you would get from your junk mail, and do something about it? Because it seems to me that the IRA was a good concept, but Congress, the Democrats, ruined it. How would you comment on that, and what would be a remedy for that?
So I think the first answer, I appreciate your question on this. The tax code itself is twice the length of the Bible, with obviously much less wisdom inside of it. But I think the heart of this is I think there's a lot of spite from politicians, both now and back then. But I'll tell you the truth, the experience I've had working in Congress and out here at Heritage is that politicians are frankly more micromanaging than they are spiteful. They think they have the answers. They think that they can run your life better than you can. And they think, well, if I just add more regulations, if I add more complexity, I'll get there. But actually, I want to borrow Giancarlo's point on this.
And that's very condescending on their part.
Amen.
Precisely. And I want to, Giancarlo's point earlier, if you have an infinite amount of law, in the end, what you have is actually no law because it is incomprehensible. I think one of the things that we have all tried doing, one of the things that certainly in the work we've all done, is trying to encourage deregulation and simplification. There's an old adage that I like a lot, which is that an engineer knows his work is done not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away.
Yeah.
And it's something that we have an opportunity with reconciliation, something we did back in 2017 with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And it's something that I think all of us would encourage Congress to use that opportunity to lend clarity and simplicity, really to trust the American public and to not have to just have a lot of tax lawyers pouring through every inch of the code.
The answer is yes, yes, and we need to clean it up. Absolutely. I can follow up with you.
Well, I want to make sure if there's any other questions on the floor. Otherwise, feel free if anybody's got any closing thoughts. Nope. All right.
I've got one closing thought that I keep thinking about time and the time that we have available. This feels very much like a closing thought. And that we can see things growing across time, but the one thing that does not grow is more time. And we can watch the regulatory restrictions measured in reg data grow. And there has to be a limit to that because there is a limit to how much time that each of us has available to read and understand them. It goes back to Patrick's fundamental problem of how am I going to read through all this code? It's so big that you can't do it. It has to be done by computers now. So unless we want to have computers do all of the reading, we need to put a limit on the amount of regulation that's available that is at a human scale that people can read and understand what the law is and figure out exactly how they can make their best choices to grow the economy, to live for themselves and live their best life.
I appreciate it. What I want to close with also for all of you is thank you for spending your time. As Parker said, it's very limited with us today. The panel you're looking at here is as a sample of the experts in this town and across the country that have worked for generations to wrestle with these problems, to make them transparent, digestible, and Congress has an opportunity. But to Bill's point, we will have other opportunities and the fight continues on. We should take whatever progress we can get here, but not lose the faith in the fight beyond that. So thank you again for all of your time, and thank you as well.